Hi, everyone, and welcome back to that UFO podcast. Joining me today, I have a tech founder, creator of UAPcaucus.com, and now director of operations for the UAP Disclosure Fund. Welcome back to the podcast, Lester Nare. Welcome.
Hello, good sir. How are you?
I'm very well, and I think I got your surname correct this
Yeah,
time. Is that right?
yeah. Perfect.
Last time I said Nare, and I was like, yeah. So, Lester, welcome back to the podcast. Really good time, and I think for a whole range of issues and topics to get into. And you're a wonderful voice in this conversation, growingly wonderful and important voice. And that's not just for me. I've seen a lot of people comment and say the same thing across multiple interviews you've done recently on various forums and online. People are enjoying listening to you speaking. I'm not a big fan of cliches, but you know, when you have like a new breed of voice or person coming through in a topic, genuinely think you're one of those, mate. So,
Appreciate
really
that.
well done. But I'm going to stop giving you compliments now. And what I'm going to say is there are more and more folks getting into the UFO conversation. And I've found many of those from the beginning of the year are quite new to the topic. So, for anyone unfamiliar with yourself, can you give us a little bit of a background as to who you are and what you do?
Yeah, no. So, I think much like many folks who are in the subject, I came to the UFO topic a little bit in a roundabout way. Um, I, I think, I've been motivated by the fact that we've seen, folks come forward. I don't think there's been enough of just work being done around the subject from a education and understanding perspective, from a how can we move the conversation forward. And so I just have created a variety of entities or have just tried to do work to help support the many folks that are in this space that are trying to, again, just get answers to the questions. So really, it's just been something where I'm a normal person. I work at a software engineering company. Like I just uh, find the time to engage in this subject because I'm passionate about it. I think it's something that deserves our attention and focus. And to the extent that many of us can continue to put work forward to, again, move the ball down the field is valuable. So I've been blessed to have the opportunity to do so and have the support of many folks in the community to elevate that work.
Yeah, and we're going to dive into some of those. UAPcaucus.com is a website many folks will know you from, and we'll get into that. It's got a new feature we're going to talk about as well, which is really important, I think, going forward, especially for some of the lazy folks like myself, but we'll get there. What I want to talk about first off is it's been about a year, just over a year, I think, since the last time you were on, which really surprised me. It was that long ago, to be honest. A lot has happened in that time. A lot has changed in the world. Mate, a lot's changed in the world since last week. I'm not going to lie.
Right.
I want to start with that change and that change of administration in the United States, because you mentioned trying to push the ball forward for the UAP topic, and that can be from an educational point of view for people who are looking at this academically. People are coming into this from a scientific point of view, a political point of view,
Yep.
and what happens in the United States affects the global platforms. And right now, the UAP topic seems to be hanging in the balance potentially. I don't know, because of things that are going on. So let's get into that then. How have you taken the change in administration from Biden to Trump and how it's impacted that UFO UAP conversation?
It's obviously a super, some people say it's a simple topic. I think it's quite complicated. I've talked quite a bit at the end of last year about how generally, if you remove the specific characters, any change of administration, any 4-year change in the US is fundamental just from an infrastructure perspective. So, for example, when you have a new administration come in or you have a change of power in any of the two houses in Congress, the House and the Senate, or two chambers of Congress, House and the Senate, leadership, like the committees within Congress, right, are where we've seen, for example, legislation
Mm.
get passed, recently over the last 4 to 5 years in the US that is driven by leadership that is running these committees. When you have a change in administration, you potentially have the change of those leadership positions. So for folks who may have followed the progress of the UAP Disclosure Act over the last 2 years and its failure to pass, part of that was due to leadership on committees within one of those chambers, particularly in the House, on the Intel Committee and the Armed Services Committee. So whenever you have a change in administration, like that's something that's on the chopping block to change. And if you have leadership change, you have potentially new opportunity. The other aspect of this is, right, you have these two branches of government, legislative and executive. The judicial branch is kind of on the sideline as it pertains to this conversation for the time being, until we start going after the people who maybe have been hiding the secret for so long.
Yeah. Yep.
If you end up getting sort of the executive branch viewing the issue as something that is beneficial to whatever their political agenda is, and they create the mandate for the legislative to do something about it, that kind of context would change the dynamics. Obviously, as we know, not only through reporting, but through the actions of the Biden administration, there was not an interest to address this issue head on. And so there was some deflection going on there. There's been a lot of chatter and hype about the incoming Trump administration looking at the subject as something that they wanted to take on, head on, along with a variety of other issues. Now, this is a very emotional subject in the US right now, and a lot of people feel like there are things being done by the current administration that are as existential to the identity of the country or to particular groups of people. And like I get that. And so I'm not making a comment saying this subject operates independent of these other political issues, but just to address it directly, right?
Yeah.
One of the things you're seeing happen is there is an effort to rewrite the social contract in the United States right now by the current administration in a very aggressive way. And that spans a variety of social issues. That sort of spans a variety of bureaucratic structure issues. And out of that arises, regardless of whether the administration wants to directly deal with this issue, the movement of stuff, of the chairs on the deck of the ship, create the chance for the door. The analogy I bring up is for the doors to be unlocked, right? So if they start unlocking doors, right, or they start removing the guards at certain doors, what that creates is the potential for what Chris Mellon and Lou Elizondo did with the original 3 Navy videos, which is to be able to have stuff come out that is done in a way that is not breaking the law, but because now the doors are unlocked, it's easier for the flow of information to escape, these controlled information environments. That has always been, to me, the most likely potential for something the dynamics to change within this administration. Or you would see, particularly with someone like an Elon Musk, as well as the variety of sort of Peter Thielites that surround this administration by way of folks like J.D. Vance, that they would view the current legacy prime defense companies that allegedly have control over this issue as a target to wrestle this stuff out of for their own personal financial benefit. And to that end, public disclosure would be a way by which they could then repatriate control over the stuff. So you can disagree with all of the other political stuff that is related to this administration. That does not change those two potential dynamic points, independent of the other stuff.
I'm going to try and simplify how I try to think of this. When I agree, under the Biden administration, and folks, I'll say it now early on, this isn't a politics podcast. If you want to go get politics chat and arguments about left, right, Democrats, Republicans, plenty of places you can go and do that and find that these days. This is about UFO stuff, naturally, but like you say, Lester, you bring it in a correct way, things will bleed in. I felt there wasn't an appetite from the Biden administration, not because of him, because I don't believe the people at the top really make a difference. And I think that's what you're saying there, aren't you? That it's the folks below, the shuffling of the deck chairs on the Titanic, that's going to make the difference, as opposed to the captain who's up there looking at other things. Is there still an appetite? It seemed there may be on the way in from Trump and co. to do something about this topic. His son had Ross Coulter, Donald Trump Jr., and he seemed really up for the UFO conversation. We were getting Anna Paulina Luna, Tim Burchett, and many others banging the doors of, the UAP conversation for some time under the Biden administration. As things began to change, it looked like Trump wins. Okay, so maybe we're going to get somewhere. is there a little bit of, you buy a home to renovate with your partner, and you go in there with a couple of ideas. We're going to tackle the kitchen first, then we're going to get into the main bedroom, and then we're going to look at that nursery later down the line. But right now we'll make that a kind of storage room. Then you get in there and realize, the floorboards are creaky. That's going to take some time. Oh, that wiring totally needs done on the second floor. We never thought about that. Looking at some dry rot in this room, and all of a sudden your little checklist you had of here's what we're going to tackle first just goes out the window, and you're firefighting, you're looking all over the place, you've got contractors coming in. It just becomes this huge major thing. Do you think that's what's happened in a way here, that things got really complicated very quickly, and the UFO issue that could become the nice kind of marble finish in the kitchen, that just goes on the back burner, and you have to then worry about everything else? Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. I was on the Emergent podcast with Reed Summers maybe 2 or 3 months ago, and I made this exact note, which is if you just look at the coming in on day one, right? There's a reason why so many folks or big names around this issue were prioritizing the first couple of weeks, days of the new administration, because you have a couple of power centers within the Republican Party in the United States, right? So you have sort of this new tech wing, which includes the like tech billionaires, the Elons, the JD Vance types, the Peter Thiel types. They seem to be in Trump's ear right now around this restructuring of the social contract. So they were the most likely to push on this issue, right? Because they want access. But you have these other cohorts that have been a part of the Republican political infrastructure for decades that have their own goals that they view they should have the first right of refusal. So you have sort of the Project 2025 wing, which is people who are focused on a lot of these social issues, the LGBTQ stuff, the border, whatever. You also have the sort of evangelicals, the religious wing, who obviously are not going to be interested in talking about what they view to be demonology. And then you have the old school sort of neocon Republican wing, right, who might view the defense companies having this stuff and the continued sort of money-making machine of the defense and the military industrial complex to be something they don't want to rock the boat on. So you have to assume that the new tech wing was going to win over all of those three others in terms of the prioritization of what the administration was going to focus on in that sort of first 100 days. And the whole point was this: if you don't get this subject as a part of the State of the Union, as a part of the salvo of initial executive orders that comes out early on, what ends up happening in every administration is you get the inertia of the things you decide to do early, right? So if now that they've put all this stuff out, what's happening? The courts are doing this, Senate and the House are arguing over appointments. And so now there's the normal process that's taking up all the oxygen in the room. And so I think your analogy is exactly correct in that so much of the reason why people were trying to push was there was that window of opportunity early to get a foot in the door to have the UFO subject be a part of the whole sort of cycle of conversation. What we're seeing now is it's going to be about apparently, tariffs, going after terrorists in Mexico, crypto becoming a core part of our financial ecosystem, getting rid of federal income tax. Like it's all of these, it's the economy stupid stuff, rewriting the geopolitical contract with our relationship with Russia and our allies. These are all like very, very big things that have massive cascading effects. And it becomes hard. You do have the Federal Declassification Task Force, which has been created. We are potentially going to see the JFK files now that National Archives has tweeted the other day that they're going to have stuff coming out there. So that is an entity that has a path. But going back to what I said earlier, one of the main things that has always been true about quote unquote disclosure is that one of the biggest factors is you have to get buy-in or an executive mandate from the president of the United States to push it, because the executive branch is the keeper of the secrets, right? Like the information is housed there. It's not housed within Congress. Efforts to get Congress to get the information is because there's an incentive for them to want it because they don't have it. So there's a power imbalance. So you can motivate them to say, hey, you don't have access to something you should. But at the end of the day, it's up to the executive branch to decide whether they're going to provide that information to Congress or not. And they have a variety of tools to say, go kick rocks. So the executive mandate is still so important as it pertains to this process. You need sort of the coordination of both executive and legislative to really substantively move it forward. So I think that's kind of what we've seen happen. And the challenge, unfortunately, is it's going to be it is going to be difficult because of how emotionally charged the environment is to get any kind of bipartisan agreement on anything, let alone the UFO subject.
Yeah, and ultimately, will this burn down right now to the point that whenever they try and maybe have those conversations, because I don't get the impression Musk, if you put him he clearly is in Trump's ear. He is literally in his ear. He is beside him constantly. If he is so key in a lot of this, he doesn't seem to have any appetite for the UFO conversation. He comes across as very, he said himself recently, didn't he? I would know, I've got the access. I don't think that's true. You've rolled your eyes. You don't think that's true. Most folk listening to this, regardless where they fall down on that political sphere, will not believe that is true, that Elon Musk would necessarily know. But if that appetite isn't there from someone like him to even go and find that, surely that's a blow for people looking for this avenue for progress.
I do agree with some caveats. One, I don't take anything that he says at face value to start with. So it's not clear to me that he actually believes what he's saying there. Like
Yeah,
there's a whole variety of reasons why that could just be a misdirection.
sure.
I also will say that there are several other people who are actually in positions of power. Kash Patel at the FBI, Tulsi Gabbard as DNI, and Ratcliffe at CIA, who have already been public on the record with the exact opposite opinion of Elon Musk,
Mm.
who are actually elected officials or in positions of power and appointed officials rather than elected officials, excuse me. But government's not a monolith. So because Elon Musk says there's nothing there, I don't think is determining factor of what will happen. However, I do think the lack of mandate and asking for those folks who are maybe pro disclosure to focus on other things. For example, right now, Kash Patel and Pam Bondi at DOJ, they're focused on the Epstein files, right? Like that's the thing right now, and the JFK files. And you could spend 4 years like adjudicating the Epstein issue, right? Like so
Let's bring this in, Lester. Sorry,
yeah,
you've mentioned this a few times now, and this was going to be something I want to talk about. This declassification task force. Again, if you're just listening to this for the first time, I've mentioned a few times, folks, a task force that has 6 months at the moment to dig into UFOs, 9/11, COVID, Epstein, JFK, Martin Luther King. Danny Sheehan said they were adding in the Bin Laden assassination to that. That was being added in. And I'm probably missing something off there. 6 months is no time at all. Like you've just said on the Epstein situation, that seems to be, if I'm going I'm going to call these conspiracies, because for your average Joe, I
sure.
think they would call these conspiracy theories, okay, not to use that as a detrimental term. If any indication of this administration coming in, we were going to get answers on the drone situation. And we know something was happening there. I don't believe it was alien or non-human, but something strange was happening with those objects on the northeast of the US. That was a damp squib, because we got a statement released to say, yep, it was all okay, all approved, nothing to see here, folks. That was disappointing, and that disappointed a lot of folks.
Yep.
Has that set the tone then that this Epstein list has come out? And again, it's not what we expected. I think people expected the cast of Toy Story to be on there, which, oh God, I hope it's not true. But it's again seems to have went down really. I think the way a lot of folks said it would. You're not going to get what you want from this. You're going to get redactions. You're going to get missing pages. And is this just going to be the way it goes for everything else on that list?
Yeah, and I think people understandably don't have confidence in, so like as an example, right? Historically, the Republican Party has not been known. I mean, the Republican Party's whole MO is the deconstruction of the administrative state, right? They don't believe in strong, big, centralized federal government. Their whole thing is wanting to break that system down. So they're not an entity that is policy forward, let's say, right? Like their concern isn't on how can we create really robust and good policy. They're focused on how can we tear all this down and privatize it. So like if that's your core ethos, right? This is why there was the view that with Biden in and Democrats who are just more policy oriented and whatever, like they would create a process and that process would be how this facilitates. This is where you get things like, you know, the UAP Disclosure Act, which was creating a process and using the bureaucracy and the system. And it was very like long and all this. That's just not
the boring politics stuff
Right.
that we're used to politics being.
Right. That's just not the MO of the modern sort of MAGA version of the Republican Party, which is much more, just for lack of a better term, like, I mean, even looking at how the Epstein stuff rolled out, which I think most people can agree was, you know, people coming out of the White House with binders doing a dance, like there's like, and
Yeah.
there's nothing. It's very much about entertainment and about dominating the news cycle, and you know, very hand wavy, right? But in terms of substance, right, it generally lacks depth in terms of generally how they approach this. So I think it's tough. Like I get why, you know, there's certainly been one of the things, there's a lack of resilience, I think, in the community generally, because we have almost this victim mentality of like every moment where something doesn't happen exactly the way we want to, it's like, oh my God, everything is over. And I don't fundamentally feel the same way. Because any political social movement that is going to be changing the status quo of entrenched power structures requires like a lot of like discomfort and blood, sweat, and tears and persistence. And momentum doesn't just like when momentum stops, you don't go back to zero and baseline. You just stop at the progress that you've made, right? So I think I've always talked about this as being a disclosure discovery paradigm, right? And I think the way I always view the situation is the political system and the government in the US is just as the tip of the spear on this issue, and ultimately is a means to an end for disclosure. When you have this sort of ebb and flow, right? It's a cycle. As more science comes out, it creates the legitimacy of the subject that creates less political risk. So politicians can then stick their neck out more to push for more information. As that happens, more funding can go into research, etc. What we saw after 2017 was the discovery side, the research side, from a scientific perspective, not from a ufology perspective, was non-existent in this subject between 2017 and through maybe 2021, 22. Only in 21, 22 did you start to see things like Galileo Project, Soul, and just like a massive amount of actual research papers begin to start. So momentum picked up. We're seeing on the discovery side, momentum is either stagnating or decreasing, right? So you're always going to have this back and forth where one or the other is having momentum. What's crazy is there's almost a huge renaissance happening in the sort of UAP research side of this equation in a way that I think a lot of people are missing, are not engaging in as much as the disclosure side, because it's more technical and it requires sort of a harder hurdle to get over and like understand what's actually happening. It's less sexy, but it's a fundamental part of like us actually getting sort of confirmation and getting the academic community to like stamp this as what's actually happening. So I think things are dynamic. We do have levers to pull still in the disclosure conversation, but we have plenty of tools in the discovery conversation that we need to continue to make sure we're spending time focusing on.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of I've been doing some research myself recently for my son's birthday, and I'm looking at getting him a PlayStation Portal. So very quickly, folks, that is a device that will allow him to stream his or my PlayStation to that device, and he can play his games without taking over the house TV and my PlayStation and whatnot. But it looks like that device, when it came out a year ago, wasn't quite fit for purpose. So it was okay, but a lot of the functionality wasn't there. But since then, work has been done in the background, which has fixed a lot of those issues. And now the same device is much more robust and a better tool than it was, as much as the hardware hasn't changed. So in a way, you're saying, is that like the UFO conversation, when one side of it seems to be stagnating or not what we expected, but it's there. There are things happening in the background to make changes and tweaks that are going to make the same things we maybe have now work better than they have before.
That's right. Because again, think about it, right? It's incredible what's happened just in 2025. We now have multiple alleged firsthand special operators as whistleblowers who have come forward, who have said they operated in the legacy program on the crash retrieval piece and are like openly talking about it and are now trying to open source the methodology. We have age of disclosure where 34 government officials are going to go on the record, some of which we know, some of whom are new, like the comments we've seen in the trailer from Jay Stratton, who has not been very aggressive in his public statements about the existence of non-human intelligence, being very direct, saying that I've, quote, touched alien crafts and alien bodies. That's happening at the same time that people are saying the administration is not going to do anything about this issue. So we have to be careful about over prescribing or over like indexing on in any direction, because this is happening, right? Skywatcher is effectively saying we're going to do this. Like, we want the government to have a chance to say no, but we're going to do this regardless. I'm not saying they're going to accomplish that, but like that's happening right now, right? So I don't actually get the level of negativity when we just got our first batch of first-time whistleblowers for the first time less than 90 days ago.
Yeah.
Right. Like so I think it's easy to get one, we need to stop over. We need to always keep our expectations in check about how this process is going to go, but we also need to be careful to not be overly negative about the reality of the situation. We're trying to have something that is arguably the most powerful secret go public. It's not going to be easy, right?
No. And it's not going to be necessarily what everyone expects it to be or wants it to be either. If there is a truth to this, and it's going to be more complex than that, it's going to be very different to what a lot of people, if not everyone, expects it to be. And I think that's been part of the issue. And we'll get to talk about the whistleblowers coming forward. And it's something everyone wanted. Everyone's got what they wanted for Christmas, but it wasn't exactly they thought it would be like. And
Right.
that's taken a lot of folks some time to get used to.
Right.
You mentioned those hearings that were back in November now as well. Do you think, not to go into details on the hearings, they were discussed at the time, but Lester, are these congressional hearings, I was going to say useful, actually, let me rephrase that. How useful at this point are congressional hearings? Because are they moving the needle in a way that we hoped or need them to?
I'll make two notes here. The first one is it all depends on how they're conducted and the leadership that moves it forward. So as a point of comparison, the Havana syndrome or anomalous health incidents hearings that happened in the Senate that also happened late last year were so successful in elevating the struggle that veterans were having getting support for the injuries that they had related to Havana syndrome that the Biden administration had to release a public statement right before the transition to the new Trump administration saying that we are briefing the incoming administration on anomalous health incidents, right? That is a testament to the success of how the hearings related to that subject were conducted, which elevated the subject. It made more people take it seriously. And then the journalistic coverage of sort of whistleblowers of that issue coming forward and speaking very candidly and directly about the struggles that they have with this, they were successful in making the issue a part of the zeitgeist and transitioning it into something that the past administration had to publicly address in a statement. So that is a real world example of something that is quote unquote a fringe issue that's not a part of the normal political calculus that was able to break through as a result of the effective execution of hearings and whistleblower interviews, right? So it's possible to do. The November hearings on the UFO stuff, there's a lot of moving parts there. We don't have to get into kind of to the weeds on it. But it was the House Oversight Committee is led by James Comer. And I've publicly stated this several times. I do not believe that he's an effective operator, just like effective at getting stuff done. He's effective at creating great clips for TV, right? But he is the gatekeeper of what House Oversight does. And there is a I'll put it this way. David Grusch testified in front of House Oversight in 2023.
Yeah.
I can state for a fact that David Grusch has never been contacted ever by anyone on the House Oversight Committee after his testimony to come in and to speak to them. I can add on to that by saying David Grusch has and still does have an active top secret security clearance with active polygraph. David Grusch can go in and provide a one-way protected disclosure to members on House Oversight or any other committee without having to do any read-ins or anything. If they want to have a bi-directional conversation where they can ask questions, it is a simple procedural process for them to do so. And no one on House Oversight, Luna, Burchett, Burleson, or otherwise, has taken the very simple procedural steps to facilitate that. Is that incompetence, or is that intentional because they don't actually have any intent to do anything about it? I don't know. But there is a lack of seriousness based on that fundamental fact set. And the thing is, like, time is passing. It's not like Grusch is going to forever hold all of those details with high fidelity, over years and years and years. So I would like to see, Representative Luna tweeted the other day she wants to bring Arrow, Lou, and Grusch in together to talk. I would like to see you guys actually reach out to these people to come in, because you have not done so. And so, like, until there is an actual outreach, there is not a level of seriousness coming out of the House Oversight based on that fact set.
When I spoke to Tim Burchett the day after the hearings, he was really frustrated. And I put to him that one of my real disappointments was hearing that it had been 18 months since Grusch had testified, July 2023, and he still hadn't been in a skiff. It was put across to me from the congressman at the time that they were being stonewalled and things were being put up in front of them.
Nonsense.
But you're saying that's just not the case, and it should be far simpler.
I'm telling you, that is false.
Do you think, would you lean more then towards being the options of A, incompetence, or B, it's a deliberate action?
I don't know. I just think it's incompetent. Like, I just think they're not serious people.
Why get involved then to the extent they appear to be? Because even, let's use Luna, who I've never spoken to Representative Luna. I've tried, as I have with representatives on both sides, Democrat and Republican. It just happens to be, folks, it tended to be the Republicans getting back to me, so that wasn't a conscious thing. Some people did reach out to me on that. Luna surely then would... So I'll just spitball this out loud, and I'm coming from a far less place of intricate knowledge of that system than you. To me, then, Luna leading the charge with this declassification task force comes across as a front for, we are going to look like we are doing something, but we know we aren't going to do it. So then that reeks of cover up, disinformation, whatever you want to call it, because you just wouldn't bother otherwise, surely.
So I think Luna is earnest in her desire to appear to be pushing for transparency for the American people. Like, I think I'm not saying that they're not being earnest, right? But there's a difference between being earnest in your intent and actually achieving outcomes. Those are two different things. And so politics in the US is about news and attention and dominating the news cycle, but we don't have a long attention span. So a lot of folks believe that they can not believe, they know they can just say something, appear to like they did it, and move on, and no one will ask questions because there's so many other things happening. A perfect example is the drone explanation you brought up earlier.
Hmm.
Nancy Mace comes in, Luna comes in. Oh my God, Trump's in office now, and he figured out the drone stuff. Oh my God, this is the greatest thing for transparency that's ever happened. I mean, that's a literal tweet from Representative Luna, which we all know is total nonsense. It's total nonsense, right? But she is going out there publicly trying to make us believe that that is transparency from the Trump administration. So, I don't know what else. I mean, that's the perfect example of what I'm trying to say, which is politics is theater and it's performance. I get that. Sometimes you can get substantive things out of that performance, right? Like, but it is fundamentally performance. This is something we've talked about endlessly. This is why in the US, the House and Senate have these caricatures about them. The Senate is the more serious, senior people who like do the real work, and the House is the rebel rousers who are loud but ineffective. I've said historically, if you look at legislation that's actually been passed in the US related to this subject, all of it has only ever come out of the Senate. The House has never passed anything that was originally introduced in the House related to this subject. The difference is the House has hosted these explosive hearings, right, that have allowed the conversation to be a part of the zeitgeist, but they have not been effective in actually adjudicating the allegations in terms of process. That's not to say that that can change, but this is not new information. I've been talking about this for 3 years, right? That's always been true, right? So we have to understand how these ecosystems work and then reverse engineer how we can get the outcomes we want out of them. But Nancy Mace and Representative Mason and Representative Luna have been loud about this issue, right? And to their credit, they've taken, they're putting their own perceived political capital at risk to talk about it. But they've made the calculation, much like a lot of other fringe subjects that have become popular in the US over the last couple of years, that it is beneficial to them raising capital in their own political profile to do so. Representative Luna wanted to be the vice president, right? So, she's ambitious in that context, right? So she'll do anything to publicly signal that she's going to make President Trump look good as a means by which she can elevate her own political profile, right? That's not something that I think is, like, I don't think she would disagree with what I'm saying there, given that she literally said, I will serve in any way that I can, Mr. President, publicly, multiple times.
Yeah, no, that's not unfair. And I think you can see that in the last few months, especially. There's a lot of young, hungry politicians in various positions in the United States who have their eyes on that White House in the coming years. And I think, if nothing, I think Trump has shown there are new ways to get to the top politically in the United States. And I think that's going to ripple throughout the world, to be honest, where it's no longer the boring politics of old, where, it was, I love Futurama. And was it you had John Jackson and Jack Johnson going against each other, and they just literally mirror what the other one says, but very, very slightly nuanced differences. That's gone.
Yeah.
And now there's every chance that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson becomes president one day. I'm just, again, folks, I'm not totally against that still.
One of the top Democratic candidates for the 2028 election is Stephen A. Smith, the sports broadcaster on ESPN.
I know who that is. Yeah.
Like, that's the like, and he had to come up publicly say it's ridiculous that I'm even on a list. I'm not qualified. But like, it just speaks to the state of the Democratic Party in terms of not having political leaders who are not a part of that old school box, right?
Yeah.
I saw a great tweet that was that just kind of described the environment now. Trump has the guyness factor, like he's the guy, right? And that Democrats don't have the guy that kind of has that same machismo, bravado, broad-shouldered leadership vibe and style, which is like a classic thing you see in a lot of like authoritarian countries. It's the Putin style. There's a lot of African countries that sort of have that same stylistics. I'm from Zimbabwe. The former president Mugabe had the same sort of political style, and that's just becoming back in vogue in the U.S. Right? And it's interesting. It is not surprising that that's happening in the context where the last election was between Trump, the guy, and Kamala Harris, and that juxtaposition made the guyness factor much more prominent, right? A lot of people didn't vote for Kamala because she was a woman, straight up. Also because she was black, straight up. And then there is obviously people who just believe that the left is full of nonsense. But like the fact that she was a woman is a non-zero factor in people's confidence in her ability to be the commander in chief.
Yeah, and in the UK, we have the opposite issue where we have a guy who, at the moment, kind of got in because of how bad the other party were viewed. Not to go all politics on this, I'm not a big political guy, but the guy we now have in is so bland in so many ways that he almost seems like putting cheese on a pizza is a bit extreme. It's almost like, that's in terms of toppings. Whoa, cheese, like whoa. But listen, let's get this back on track. UAP not the Disclosure Fund, the UAP Disclosure Act you brought up a couple of times there, and this failed to go through twice. And when I brought that up with Danny Sheehan, Danny was really keen to get across there were elements of it that passed.
Yeah.
However, in terms of like a big way, what folks really concentrated in on was the Presidential Review Board, the group of 9 panelists who would basically declassify all the UFO stuff, essentially. And then there was the eminent domain clause where, although you'll know more about this than I do, some folks say eminent domain's irrelevant because the US government always has that anyway. The president can deal with that. But so it's almost more of a show that we are going to come in and take back the UFO goods that have been handed to private contractors wrongly throughout the years and decades. Those didn't go through. Some other big things didn't go through. Are we going to see that brought back up in this administration with that change or that shuffling of the deck, as you mentioned? Or do you think a new approach is required?
I'll answer these in 2 buckets. So, 1, Senator Rounds has already stated that he is going to try to reintroduce a version of the UAPDA. I think it'll be a modified version of the the one that was tried to be passed the last 2 years. Separate from that, there is an effort to create a review board by way of executive order, right? Like that's the other angle, right? So one angle you could do it by legislation, one angle you could do it by executive order. So like those are the 2 paths. I think both are being explored as possibilities. I personally, I understand the idea of the UAPD, like the structure of what the UAPDA is creating, because it leans into this understanding of the information control issue, which is that at the end of the day, it is the purview of the president, who is the ultimate controller of the information, which is why you want the review board to be a presidential review board, and have that declassification process formalized. I actually I took some time late last year to kind of go through the process of creating an alternative approach, which is not dissimilar to the review board, but it basically we sort of drafted at UAP Caucus. We drafted 4 executive orders of like how would we, like, just blank slate starting from scratch, right? Because this was in the wake of it not passing the second time. Like how would we approach this by way of like an executive order, executive action?
Sure.
And so I think there are. So we have an alternative approach that creates sort of a repatriates control by way of executive order and creates a interagency process that is not necessarily a review board, but is similar. There's also a model that Bob Pliskin on Twitter has put out around just creating regulation for the material. Because there's already existing criminal law, which is like, so if you just create a regulatory structure, what you end up doing is you create basically an avenue for people to be able to make criminal complaints, because it will now become illegal to be in possession of the material, and it's easier to pass, and it requires no cost, right? There's no, You don't have to pay $20 million to create this review board and stuff. And so you basically create a pipe that enables the information to come out of these private companies that have this stuff and the protections of those people without having to create new whistleblower protections. So that's like another interesting approach. So I'm just identifying that like there is more than one way to crack this nut in terms of, the UAPDA structure in the review board works, but it's not the end all be all. So we'll see. Obviously, there are several people, that are trying to work this administration in a variety of ways, whether that's by way of a quote unquote UFO czar out of the White House that takes a sort of Elon Musk type role that he has at Doge and is just points and says, here's where all the bodies are buried, go figure it out. There's the review board approach, there's a regulatory approach, there's an interagency process approach. So it's like we have there's options that can be put on the table to address it. It just becomes, is there going to be the desire to do so, whether it's for personal benefit or otherwise?
The UAP Disclosure Fund is an organization that sprung up in the last year or so. You are now an official member, and unless anything's changed, then you are still an official member. I've had Yuan Feng on the podcast, founder of said Disclosure Fund, in the last year, talking about the workings of the group, what it's all about, what they hope to achieve, what some of the aims are. Some huge names attached to the group include Gary Nolan, Chris Mellon, Carl Nell is on my list. We'll get to that. Lou Elizondo and others. First off, do you want to just tell us in your own words, Lester, what is the UAP Disclosure Fund for anyone unaware, and what is your role within the group now?
Yeah, so I'm director of operations at the UAPDF, and it's very straightforward, right? We're one of the preeminent civil organizations that are pushing forward for policy and infrastructure around the disclosure process. And it's very similar to any other issue, right? Like if you think about any other social issue, you have people who are doing thought leadership about how do we actually accomplish the task, right? Because if you think about members of Congress and their staffers, they have a million things that they're worried about on a daily basis, right? So they have to be juggling a lot of balls. That doesn't give them time to necessarily go very deep on these issues in terms of how to deal with it. So as a tangible example of like what are the things that we've done towards this issue. So number one, we held the first event in the Senate after the November hearings last year, where we brought together national security, foreign policy staffers, as well as members. We had Rep. Burleson, Representative Rounds, and Representative Burchett show up, and actually Senator Cory Booker passed briefly as well, who is very interested in this subject, interestingly enough. And just to create a melting pot of people talking about this. And there's the speeches are on the website, so you can see Lou made a speech, Tim Gallaudet made a speech. Senator Mike Rounds presented Lou with a redlined copy of the UAP Disclosure Act and thanked him for his courage around this subject. Senator Rounds has been a real bastion of support around this issue, and he's going to continue to do so. So that was one thing. In tandem with that same week, we put out an expert letter signed by several college university professors from Yale, from Harvard, from Stanford, like from all premier universities, who basically are calling for Congress to do something about this issue. It was the first of its kind. That was also written into the record at the hearing. So that expert's letter is on the congressional record as a result of the work that we've done. In addition to these things, like just in terms of like what is like the day-to-day look like, we had a forum on the drone issue where we brought in experts around how can local police departments address this issue. And that's a kind of an ongoing process now where we have multiple state governments who are very upset with how the federal government handled the drone issue, who are now looking to set up their own UAP task forces. And this is actually sort of new. We're working with one state government right now who's looking to set up their own UAP task force currently, independent of the federal government. And this is just a good reminder for people, like government and politics is not just federal, right? These military bases and this infrastructure exist in states where states have their own government and their own tools and their own processes. So there's a whole untapped ecosystem. And again, the drone issue has made the UAP subject very prominent for governors, for mayors, for local PDs, who are now coming to us regularly, wanting to, do something about this issue. So that's another piece. And then the last piece I'll touch on is, you're seeing, I know a lot of people have probably seen there's this podcast series that's now being put out around like breakthrough, aerospace science, etc., where they're regularly talking about this issue that's being run out of the National Institutes of Health and the Small Business Administration. Like, those conversations are arising because at the event we had at the end of November, the person who's running that series actually came and talked to us and was like encouraged and said, "I'm going to push this forward. Thank you all for like creating an environment where this is being normalized." And we're also now we're bringing folks in from the research and science community to provide briefings to staffers and members of Congress on the science of UAP, what research needs to be done in order to be able to get a better understanding of this issue. So this is the kind of stuff that's happening. On top of, we have policy briefs that are on the website. So Lou Elizondo put out his policy brief about advanced strategic capabilities and the need to deconflict, excuse me, those from the UAP issue. We also have the newest member of our advisory board, Dylan Guthrie, put out over 50-page, the first of its kind legal analysis on the UAP subject, which is fantastic. And it's in the Harvard National Security Review Journal, peer-reviewed journal. I mean, this is like tangible stuff, right? That's trying to, again, activate more ecosystems. There's such a focus on, is Trump going to do it? Is Trump going to do it? There's all this other stuff that like we can be doing. And so that's kind of the work that we do at UAPDF is trying to really push the thought leadership. How do we address this issue? What are the mechanics? For anyone who's like, the paper that Dylan wrote is really interesting. It's a little dense, but there's a lot there. He also did a podcast that's in it's in I can't remember the publication. Excuse me, it's totally escaping me right now. But he did basically a 30-minute defense scoop. He did a 30-minute sort of high-level overview. It's really, really fascinating. So there's a lot of material to actually dig in. I know people don't like reading, but we've put out a lot of stuff that's like actually relevant. And that all is kind of the front-facing stuff. In the background, one of the key things we're trying to do is also really create a pipeline to help whistleblowers come forward and that process. I can't really speak to that as much. That's not really my lane. But that is another sort of core aspect of what we focus on.
I'll let you grab a drink to sort your throat out if you like there, Lester, just for a moment. And if folks want to hear more about the Disclosure Fund and maybe some of those kind of pipelines and the avenues they're looking to support whistleblowers, go and check out When I Spoke to Yuan Feng. He goes into that in some detail as well. And I just want to reiterate something that it can often feel like you mentioned there. You mentioned some of the names that we're familiar with who were involved in the Senate after the hearings. Tim Burchett, we know it's. I know you said before about some potential issues with multiple people and how much they really are trying to push it forward. But on the surface, there are names, and then you mentioned one senator walked by briefly. There are individuals, groups, and institutions who are very interested in this topic. I know of a couple in the UK of major institutions, academically, scientifically, who have people really pushing this subject, and they are very supportive of it, but maybe just not publicly at the moment. So if anyone ever gets disappointed or disheartened or wonders, I genuinely think there is a real underlying support for the UFO topic that, and I'm going to ask you, do you feel this as well, Lester? I can see you're nodding, that there is that support there. There's like a grassroots hidden movement. If people remember during the war, where people would be in the tunnels under the UK, and the streets might look quiet and deserted, but the underground was buzzing with people. I think that's what it can be like, right now.
I'll point out something that's interesting related to what you're saying, which is, listen to what Jake Barber has said as he's come forward about how in 3-4 years ago he was coming to members of the Senate and trying to talk to them, and how their reaction was being paralyzed by what to do. So there are certainly more people that have come public and made statements that are extremely interested in this subject from a personal curiosity perspective and from a getting to the bottom of it perspective. But a lot of those same people are also paralyzed by, what am I supposed to do about this?
Yeah.
Especially as you get into some of the weirder aspects of this and or the more dangerous aspects of this. I think people shouldn't underestimate the potential danger that folks who really brush up against this, trying to get it out, might be having. And, a lot of people are not in the business of putting themselves at personal risk unnecessarily, particularly people who are political animals. So I think that is true. I don't want to over index that, though. I want to couch that by saying that's not to say everyone is on board and all of that stuff. Obviously not.
Yeah.
But it is somewhere in between those two things.
Yeah, no, I would agree. So again, if you can take some solace, folks, from knowing that there are folks out there really interested, and I don't doubt in the future would get on board, or if things change in a big way, there is support there, almost like a second battalion. I think if you remember Avengers, when Captain America's ready to fight Thanos on his own, and he just hears, Sam in his ear going, "On your left, Captain," just when you think all is lost, all the portals open up behind him and everyone comes through to help out. That maybe that happens down the line, maybe in a much more real way than we can imagine.
I mean, even just looking at Age of Disclosure that's about to come out here in a couple of days,
yeah.
there are new faces there that we haven't seen before that are like saying the same things, right? So,
I'm going to ask you about that in just a second, but
yeah,
first off, I did mention Carl Nell as part of
yes,
the UAP Disclosure Fund.
yes.
He has now departed the organisation. Is there any update you can give us as to what that was all about? Or
I'll couch it as, if you get not every job allows you to have a presence on a nonprofit board
Mm,
that is in the same arena in which your job is, right? So I
sure,
think a lot of people are maybe reading into it a little too much. Um, you know, uh, if you work for the government, you can't be on the board of a nonprofit. I'm not
sure.
suggesting that Carnell is about to go work in the government, but you can use that as a reference point.
Yeah, I've seen some allusions to that potentially that being the case, and it certainly didn't seem. Well, there wasn't a whole lot coming from the organisation publicly, which is probably a good thing anyway. And not that it's a secretive organisation, but it's just quietly doing its work in the background. Like when I spoke to Yuan Feng, as he said himself, we're doing the work and it's got to be done quietly. You don't need every group like this shouting from the rafters about how wonderful they are and what they're trying to do. Because sometimes, as much as I would love everything to be public and transparent. And, if you could all send out a daily newsletter as to what you've done that day, 5 bullet points for the UAP Disclosure Fund as to what you've done that week. Sorry, Elon. That would be great. And I could talk about it and other folks could talk about it. But sometimes it's better that these things get done quietly in the background. And I think you get more fruit from that at times. Is that fair enough?
That's fair. And I'll just also say, like, there's a lot less cloak and dagger. Like, look, I have a lot of people who will know me, and I'm very candid. There's a lot less cloak and dagger. If you've never worked at a nonprofit and don't understand how nonprofits work and how the board like intersects with the operators, it's a volunteer operation, right?
Mm.
It's not as sort of cigars in a back room plotting the plight of the beluga whale. Like it's folks who are trying to find, with what limited time they have, like, ways to maximize it. So I think I think folks are lack of information creates a lot of like people use their imagination to fill that space. It's really not that it's not that deep, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah. No, and I look forward to the organisation carrying on and doing the work that we would all hope it's doing in the background, especially facilitating those whistleblowers in coming forward, which is a big thing. On that, you've mentioned Age of Disclosure. The premiere is this weekend at South by Southwest. So we're recording this just for reference, folks. Evening UK time on the 7th of March, Friday the 7th. It's the afternoon in the United States. And on the 9th and 11th of March, there are two showings at the Film Festival, South by Southwest, of Age of Disclosure in two separate viewing areas. Now, this isn't like you can buy tickets publicly, but this is the kind of place where a lot of really cool features, documentaries get their first showings. Right now, and I was emailing folks who are involved in the distribution of Age of Disclosure today. There is nothing at all they can announce, or I don't even know if they have, in terms of distribution, when it's going to be released to the public. by the time this comes out, Lester, that could have all changed. Maybe they announced that at South by Southwest, but right now it could be at the event. They have folks there from Netflix, Apple TV, to be any streaming service, Amazon Prime, or maybe they get a theatrical release. I still find that unlikely. I think that would be a reasonably big thing. I think cinema is struggling as an industry, and I'm someone who has one of those unlimited cinema tickets. I love going to a movie theater, folks, and watching a film. I would rather do that than get it live on my TV. There's an experience to it, but I think it's something that's dying off, unfortunately. So it isn't maybe the biggest issue if this doesn't get a theater release that some are hoping for. But that you've mentioned a few times, there's 34 names attached to this documentary, many of which are known throughout the UFO community, many attached to the political arena, the intelligence communities. The big statements you've mentioned, Jay Stratton turning heads by saying essentially, I have seen non-human bodies, I have seen non-human craft. Let's talk about that, Lester. And I've spoke about this with a few guests. My concern, and some others, are that there could potentially be a qualifier before that statement where Jay Stratton says, before the camera cuts in the trailer, what we need is someone to come forward and say, I have seen non-human bodies. I've been told by folks I would trust that isn't the case.
Okay.
And he is saying what he says he is saying, and it's not been dressed up for the cameras. I can't guarantee that, but
Sure.
I've been assured by a couple of folks, no, Andy, don't worry, that's not the case. What is your thoughts then on that as a statement?
I honestly was really surprised when I saw that in the trailer from Jay. I don't have any. I've never met him in person. I don't really. He's kind of a part of a community that I don't know. Really, like I'm not in his circle or whatever. So I can only, my only reference point is his 1 or 2 interviews he's done with George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell, and the public statements on his Twitter, all of which has been very cagey, right?
Yeah.
And the references in the books like Hunt for Skinwalker and all that stuff, where we now know that he was the one of the reference people there. I find it very surprising. If you talk to anyone in and around the UAP task force, every single person speaks extremely highly of Jay Stratton. He really went to bat for folks on the subject when they were doing this work, and gave them the tools to be successful, and gave them the freedom of movement to really go after it. And I think that, like, being a good like, to have everybody be that positive about you, I mean, is reflective of him being a good leader. Arguably, and I think George Knapp has framed this, he's the person who is most associated with and has led the public-facing UFO study programs through OSAP, through ATIP, and through UAPTF. So he's arguably, the most well-versed as it pertains to the public study programs that we know about. He probably has the more exposure than almost anybody. And so for that statement to come from him means that he feels sufficiently confident, one, that some other process by way of the government, like, he's not going to base, like, they're all patriots, so no one wants to sort of spill the beans in a way that's going to be negative for U.S. national security.
Unfortunately.
So, but at the same time, the way he couches his statement is, and I know a lot of people have concerns about this, is in the we're in an arms race context, right?
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, we need to beat the Chinese and we need to beat the Russians, and that sort of militaristic intelligence angle, which of course he's going to say that because that's the environment that he's from. I'm not saying I agree or disagree, but like, what do you want him to say? Like, he's worked in that space his whole life.
That's his world.
That's his world. That's his viewpoint. So I do think it will be interesting to see how the editorial context of Age of Disclosure is presented.
Yeah.
Because it seems like there's going to be there's sort of a twofold thing we're seeing. It's sort of like there's opportunity with, like, Chris Mellon saying things like, what the benefits for energy of this technology coming forward. And there's also the arms race piece. And I think the concern that a lot of people have is, if the US, China, or Russia are a first mover on disclosure or confirmation, does that inherently supercharge the sub rosa Cold War, to use Carl Mell's words, that's happening around the reverse engineering process? Because again, like, the underlying technology is fundamentally dangerous in the context of it being utilized from a military industrial complex perspective. I can make it akin to AI, right? Like, artificial general intelligence in a vacuum is not dangerous, but in the hands of human beings who have bad intent can be extremely dangerous. And that's true here as well.
Yeah.
So it's all complicated. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how it's framed. I'm interested to see who else beyond the people in the trailer are in there. Obviously, the Clapper, James Clapper, I think, was the other one in the trailer that was new, which I was somewhat surprised by. But to make an interesting reference, Admiral Mike Rogers, who led the NSA, while Clapper, I believe, was director of the CIA at the time, was on a podcast or some program at the end of last year where the UFO issue came up. And he specifically said that Clapper had come to him when he was leading the NSA and asked him to pull everything the NSA had on UFOs. And Mike Rogers was kind of like, is this a test? Like, I thought he was joking at first, and he was like, no, I'm serious. And then he did so and provided it. And Mike Rogers was like, look, like, there's weird stuff. I don't know what it is. I don't know that I've seen anything that I can say is definitively aliens, but there is weird stuff there. Another, again, high-level government official who's like admitting that there's weird data, but not wanting to ascribe a source. So there is like a connective tissue as to like Clapper being interested in this subject. He's a very controversial figure in politics because he's associated with a whole variety of witch hunt stuff, whatever. So I do think it'll be interesting to see the balance between Democrats and Republicans, or figures that people view, because it's like you have Clapper, but you also have Rubio, right? You have Clapper, and then you also have Burchett. So it's hard to sort of push back on it as like, oh, this is a Democrat, blah, 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 or this is a Republican, blah, 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 because you're seeing very polarizing figures in the narrative of U.S. politics on both sides, all effectively saying the same thing.
How effective can this documentary be as a vehicle to move the needle? And I'm hearing folks say that this could be the one. This could be huge. This could be as big a push for capital D disclosure as we've ever had, because of the gravitas of the folks involved. But on the other hand, it is still just a documentary. And I've seen a lot of folks recently, and we talked about this, Lester, just before we hit record, where there are some folks who feel a burnout on the topic. And it's almost like the sheer volume of news, information, I've talked before about the fracturing of the disclosure process. I feel, to really simplify it, a couple of years ago, I feel there was, Lou Elizondo at the tip of the spear, and a large number of folks were behind Lou, and we were all charging towards this disclosure process. Since then, there are different groups, different camps, different people, and there are so many folks who have all gone different ways. It almost seems like people are looking for a team to follow that they don't have anymore, because their favorite teams all split up. Not that they've fallen out, they are just going down their different routes. And there's like almost a burnout for some folks on the topic that, just on that burnout, what is your take, and what would you say to folks listening to this who are like, God, it's getting difficult to keep going?
I totally get it. And I think it's fair. And like, if you're burnt out, give yourself the like, check out, right? And go away and spend time with the kids, and like go watch sports, and like go enjoy the beauty of life, right? Like, you don't have, like, it's not required that you like be miserable and trying to, like, we're trying to do something that's extremely difficult. We're trying to change a fundamental power structure that is entrenched for decades and move that, right? That's not something that's going to be easy. So I think there's, Richard Dolan and Bryce Zabel put out, after Disclosure, maybe 15 years ago, as a book about like all of the things that need to be done, or that will need to be addressed as a part of this process. It's a long list of stuff. It's very daunting. there's not an appetite. Like, the status quo is good for a lot of people, and disclosure disrupts the status quo in a way that is going to require people's lifestyles to change, power structures to change. It's not something that people necessarily want to do. When we look at your point about teams, right? There is almost zero agreement between any of the big names that you could put on a piece of paper that have been publicly coming out around this issue on not only what is happening, but also what we should do about it, what should happen first, what is the best vehicle and methodology to accomplish it. There is almost zero agreement on any of those things, right? Understandably so, because not only do people have different viewpoints and information, right, that they can't really understand what the other person knows because it's classified and all these other things, the stovepiping issue, but people also potentially have their own liability as it relates to this subject. And so they might want to talk about this piece, but not that piece. And the other person might be like, well, I want to talk about that piece, but not this piece, right? So I think that the fracturing is natural given the scope of the problem, the scope of potential liability and risk for individuals, right? And people are wanting to protect their own legacies, right? And protecting their futures and jockeying for position. I mean, it's like that quote from the movie Contact, when the guy's like, this is the race of the millennium, and everyone's jockeying and positioning themselves for, what the outcome is going to be. If you believe the allegations that there is a UFO crash retrieval and reverse engineering program has been operating for decades, you should expect that this is how people would act in that context. Like, this should be the expected behavior, if you believe it to be true. So folks acting surprised or like means that, in my view, like you haven't really internalized that this is a real thing, because if it's a real thing, the complexities and it are just so great that it is going to be a total, what show to deal with. That's the only way that this happens, right? It can't be, there's no clean, like, it's going to be a mess inherently. And so if we operate from that context, right, this is why Carl Nell calls it catastrophic disclosure versus controlled disclosure, which I hate that framing and I don't like that language. That's a topic for another day. But that's why they call it like that, because it is a mess, particularly if from the US's government perspective, if you have derivative technology, that's advanced strategic capabilities that would brush up against the UAP stuff, you can't talk about one without revealing the other. And so you're kind of in a rock and a hard place, because those advanced strategic capabilities may be really crazy. Like, they may be really powerful, and they may be things that, again, you don't want the North Koreans understanding, the Iranians understanding, or whatever. I'm not saying that's a justification to not do disclosure. But, I also don't want the end of human civilization to happen because of reasons that I don't understand about the implications of the underlying stuff. So I'm okay saying I don't know what I don't know about it, right? And that, like, that there are potential negative outcomes that come with what I think is the right thing to do, which is that the public has a right to know.
A huge section of the public has just got a slice of the UFO topic that we maybe didn't expect. Maybe not catastrophic disclosure, but clostrophic disclosure, with Khloe Kardashian hosting Stephen Greer on her podcast that I didn't know she had, but of course she has one. Quick take, I don't know if you've watched it. I've only managed 15 minutes of it so far, and good God. He's quite sickening on how I've never seen Stephen Greer on any media before, and this may just be a me thing, praise someone as much as he does her in the first 15 minutes, and he doesn't interrupt her. And I remember he tells her how smart she is and what a great question she asks at one point. And yeah, it's, for me, you can, and I'm talking down about it because of the people involved, and I pride myself in never having watched the Kardashians. I think that's a badge of honor I wear. But ultimately, is it a good thing for progress and public perception to have someone with such a huge audience as Khloe Kardashian talking about UFOs on her program?
It's a good question. Um,
It's not an easy answer.
yeah, I think what I would say is we're still so much in the first inning that any attention is good attention. I think that's the easiest way to say it.
Yeah.
Because there's still so many people that don't even know about where we are in the current dynamic. And this is kind of why I've been doing a lot of the work that I do, which is what I call like creating these on ramps for people to get into
Yeah.
the subject. And like a lot, everyone's on ramp is different. Some people don't trust the government. I mean, part of the thing with me, I'm a young black guy. A lot of black people in America don't trust anything related to government or the military or intelligence, understandably so, for a good reason. And so they can't there's not an on ramp for a huge part of our populace. And so someone like me creates at least a visual reference of like, okay, well, this is a regular person, they look like me, let me maybe at least see what this guy has to say. And I've seen that in my audience in terms of like that being the result. Some people adore the Kardashians and will take what they say as gospel and
Mm,
won't take anything else from any other. They don't care about a congressional hearing. They don't view that as valuable.
yeah.
They don't care about this military stuff. They don't view that as valuable. They don't want the research. But if Khloe says it, now they're interested, right? And so that people just get their information from different sources. And so we have to recognize, and this is one of the challenges we have as a community, we can't be so insular and inward facing, right?
Yeah.
Like we have to go on. Like I went on, your mom's house and like did this whole podcast with the Austin, like Christina P and that whole, comedy sort of site. And that opened the subject up to a whole different cohort
Yeah.
of people that are not on UFO Twitter, they're not on Reddit, whatever. So like a fundamental aspect of disclosure is getting billions of people, billions on ramped to the subject, right?
Yeah.
And necessarily, in order to do that, you have to meet them where they are. We can't be like lecturing down from our like ivory tower of like, obviously they exist. I can't believe you don't what like that's not gonna get people engaged, right? So without like commenting on Greer's approach and style and substance of what he actually said, kudos to him for continuing to try to reach a wider audience on channels that historically we as a community have not necessarily prioritized.
Yeah, and it's completely unselfish and not self-serving of him whatsoever to appear on with one of the Kardashians. So, Stephen, that interview invite is still open if you want to choose to bring yourself down to my podcast. Just waiting on a reply from you still, but I'm sure Chloe's a much better get than I would be.
I will briefly say, I've never met him, but please stop claiming that the executive orders that I wrote are something that you know about because you
Mhm.
don't. So he went out publicly and made some claims about my stuff that he had no information about. So
Lester, I can't and won't believe that Stephen Greer would make any such claims that of things he didn't know about. And I am glad to hear that 16 months ago he managed to avoid a brutal death at the hands of the gatekeepers because reasons. He told this on the to Khloe Kardashian as well. So yeah, I know a lot of people like Stephen Greer. He's an on ramp for so many folks. I get people reach out to me who say, "I've just found the podcast. Enjoying interviews with X, Y, or Z. I got into this through Stephen Greer, blah, 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 blah." And it's like, cool, great. That there's someone now listening to me and others because of Stephen Greer. I speak to people publicly who I work with, or I meet folks at my son's football coaching and stuff. And often folks will say, I saw this guy's documentary. And if it's not Jeremy Corbell, it tends to be Stephen Greer. And they'll say, I saw this on Netflix, I saw this on Amazon. Yeah, what do you think about that? It's an on ramp, and there are so many different on ramps. So yeah. What?
I'll
Go on,
briefly
man.
end by saying at the end of the day, and I think Jake Barber actually has said this as well too. Greer has been the earliest and probably the closest to being correct about a lot of things
Mm,
and has done a lot for the subject. And over time the incentives may have changed and a whole variety of other things. But I don't want to I just want to be clear that I'm not trying to discount the fact that um he was a early first mover, and
Yep.
and he's been directionally accurate, generally speaking. And so I'm not discounting that. That's all.
George Lucas done a hell of a lot for Star Wars and science fiction. You don't have to enjoy his later work to appreciate the early stuff, folks. I'll say that much.
Great analogy.
And you mentioned Jake Barber and Skywatcher. This is probably, for me, been the big story of 2025. 2024, there seemed to be a real void or absence of whistleblowers that I think after Dave Grusch came forward in 23, we were waiting on this avalanche. It was like, oh, there's the guy. There's a guy coming forward. Enter more Dave Grushes, and we were left hanging. One or two names potentially come into call there, but largely we didn't get the swath of names coming forward we hoped for. 2025 lands, and here's Jake Barber sitting across from Ross Coulter talking about being a helicopter pilot with this really cool background and CV, very secretive, but he was basically retrieving UFOs, and part of the mission, he would take them to a location and drop them off, and then that was his job done. He was a UFO taxi driver, essentially. What was your take on this story before we get to Skywatcher as an organization? When you first saw Jake come out, what he said and how it was presented?
So I had some very, very light awareness that it was coming down the pipeline, and one of my concerns was about editorial, right? Like, when Dave came forward, right? There was a progression of like how he did it, the debrief article, then the News Nation interview, and then that led to the hearing. And this is like classic public relations, right? Like how you your first impression like matters and all this stuff. So I think there are a variety of ways the story could have come out. It ended up coming out the way that it did. Number one, I think these guys are, anyone who wants to come forward and put their neck on the line, like, God bless you, right? Like so I want to start there. Like it takes a lot of, bravery and courage to want to push up against this, especially some of the weirder aspects. Unfortunately, I think the initial 1 hour special just had bad editorial cut for it, because this Jake's and Co.'s story is very complex.
Yeah.
And I think they tried to sort of cover it all in a way that didn't make any of it very, very clear. All of the follow-on stuff has been, I think, much better. The full uncut interview, I think, was fantastic, and like I think was much easier to sort of follow. As someone who's like very attuned to this issue, I found the original 1 hour special hard to follow, which is like,
and you say 1 hour, Lester. If you take the breaks and the ads out, I think it's a 41 minutes, because I watched the file of, so not even an hour to cram what the uncut was 2 hours, 40 minutes, 2.5 hours.
Right.
You're condensing a lot. But there is a whole audience and generation of folks who are consuming quick content. Yeah.
Which I totally understand. That is a News Nation problem. That is not a Ross problem, right?
Yeah.
So, but I think so many interesting pieces connected as a result, for me, as a result of Jake coming out, particularly like the context of like Michael Herrera's story and like how they intersected at Greer's 2023 thing, and then now Michael Herrera having better context for what he experienced. The psionics piece, obviously, which people have talked about for a while, but has not really been a part of the mainstream conversation, which that's a whole nother thing we can talk about. But overall, like, I think number one, this is what everyone's been asking for, right? I tweeted the Shia LaBeouf meme from Transformers, like, hey guys, look, this is what you wanted, right? This is what you're, stop complaining. This is happening. Like, let's go. Like, let's go do the work, right? If whistleblowers are going to come forward, right, they want to do so in a way where they're not going to then have their lives be totally destroyed and torn. And there's been a lot of like tearing down of these guys in a way that I'm like, why do you think these people don't want to come forward? right? Like, if this is going to be how we respond, like, obviously they're not going to want to come forward. So I think it's great that they have done so. This is the first time we're having tier one operators, from the legacy program ecosystem filling in the blanks. That's moving the ball down the field. That's progress. We have to adjudicate the claims. We have to do all this. I think their idea is that they're going to do that by way of Skywatcher. So they already have this built-in process to say, like, this is going to be the vehicle by which we prove what we're saying, right? Instead of waiting for a hearing and to be called to Congress and for disclosure, like, they recognize that the claims are fantastical. So, like, we have to sort of create a pathway to, show where's the beef. Everyone wants to know where the beef is. I get it, right? Totally. And so this is the first time where we're seeing an organization or a group who was in a position to know, understands the workflow, saying, we're going to show you the beef. That's the claim. So
the
I
issue
yeah.
though, Lester, is the beef is going to be summoned psychically and brought out of the sky, and that for a lot of folks is, you can look at it and go, that's what we want. This is what we've wanted. That is a huge claim. How do you realistically see this playing out, though? Because it almost seems like it could be an end game for disclosure, because if this group can do what they are claiming they can do, it reminds me of when Tom Cruise said in Scientology, he was at a level where he could levitate off the ground. And I've always said, if you can show me Tom Cruise levitating, not in movie form, live on the news, live on TV, 60 minutes, something like that, I will jump to Scientology right now. I am yet to see Tom Cruise levitate. Disclaimer, folks, I am not saying he can't, right? I'm a big Tom Cruise fan. He is the last action hero. However, the claims are just so deep. And I've said a few times very quickly, I was on a friend's podcast recently. It's like social commentary, fun culture stuff. And they aren't UFO guys, but they wanted to talk to me about UFOs. And I sent them this. And one of them watched the Jake Barber 40-minute News Nation stuff. One of them flicked through it. And they said, sounded interesting at first when the guy was picking UFOs up with his helicopter. Soon as he talked about feminine divine energies and experience, total red flags, bullshit, turned off.
Yep. No, I mean, this goes back to my point earlier about, public relations, how you tell the story matters, first impressions matter. And I get it. Like,
was it too quick? Sorry to interrupt, but
no.
Was it too quick? Because again, like you say, Shia LaBeouf, this is what you all want, folks. Here we go. What I would like is the Brent Spiner Independence Day doctor type character being dragged out the desert after 10 years, and the guy's working on the craft. This is almost as good. And people went, huh.
And I understand, like, I get it. I totally get it, right? Two things I'll say, like, I totally get it. And I think the psionic part is hard to grok, right? The consciousness connection has always been the hard part to grok about this issue. It's not clear to me. This is my own conjecture. It's not clear to me whether or not the psionic part is is it the two things in the story that were interesting to me was the Panasonic Tough books. That didn't make sense to me. And then the psionic piece, how it's framed. Obviously, we have remote viewing. There's a Stargate program. There's a whole legacy of these sort of consciousness study programs that have practical functional effects. So it's not like there's context for it being a thing that the U.S. government has been engaged in for a long time. I part of me thinks, right, because and Jake sort of said this, is that some of the who is the audience is always the question we need to ask, because a lot of times we're not necessarily the audience for some aspects, right?
Yeah.
They're using the medium of the public media stuff and dropping words that are for other people, not for us, Joe Public, as a signaling tool, right? So the Panasonic Tough books for me didn't make sense, and I think may potentially a term for something else, right? And the person who's supposed to know what that means knows what that means, right?
Yeah.
That's totally my conjecture. The psionics piece, we know that we've already heard from someone before that the government might be in the business of summoning these things, and crash retrieval actually might be a misnomer, right?
Mm-hmm.
How are these things crashing all the time? Well, if they've actually been attracted and then brought down, they're not actually crashing, which would sort of explain that away. But Lou Elizondo had been public years ago talking about, for some frequencies, we try baiting UFOs, right? That's sort of been in the lexicon, but he didn't frame it as psionics, right?
Mm-hmm.
He framed it as there's maybe a frequency you can tune into that brings them, right? That's his words. So I don't know if, like, there's two pieces. Is there a methodology that's technical or mechanical or functional that's being used? And then the psionics is like they're trying to figure out like ways in which to like there may be two separate processes is all I'm trying to say. And
Yeah.
so like the summoning piece, it may be that when you have people who are doing the psionic stuff nearby, helps to amplify like a standard, more just mechanical process or whatever. Like it's not clear. Like it's not clear to me. Like it's a little fuzzy. I think there's a lot to dig there, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So it'll be interesting to see that. But coming back to kind of your point of like, how does this play out, right? What are you going to have CNN in the desert, right? With
Why not?
Cristiano Poor, right? Like looking up here and then the things there, right? I think if I'm not like, I don't have any say in what Skywatcher does or whatever. Like they're their own thing. And so this is, if I were them, I would set up their operation like a frontier research lab, the same way you see companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, DeepMind, right? Who are pushing the boundaries of what they call like artificial general intelligence. And it's frontier, and it's sort of this like thing that they're trying to go after something that is not, they're not quite sure how it works or where it is, but like it's a frontier technology play. To me, setting it up as like a research lab and grounding it in like a fundamental research process, putting out data sets and papers would ground it in a way that the way your friend responded, kind of it separates it, like it creates a foundation of like, oh yeah, there's scientific rigor here. And then you can address the crazier aspects with that as your backbone, right? But if you come straight into because the problem with the summoning without that backbone is people will be like, oh, is it Greer flares, CE5? Like it just gets mired in a whole variety of prior biases that people have about this stuff. So I think
even, sorry, Lester, but even for the public, the issue is with such a claim, it's actually very straightforward to a member of the public, because if I say to my friend, I can summon UFOs, essentially, they'll say, okay, do it now.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Oh, then what always happens? Well, it's not as easy as that. Sure, it's not. Okay. But then perhaps,
I agree.
and something I would think, and this is, I think, where I hope they come out with some of this information, perhaps location matters. That I can't just do it above Leicester's house because you live blah, 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 blah. Maybe you have to be near a body of water. Perhaps there are certain military installations or locations that are out in the middle of somewhere, which isn't a small piece of desert. It's hundreds and hundreds of miles, which is cordoned off under the guise of special access programs and black ops and testing black budget technology, when perhaps they know that actually within this range, this is a really good spot for doing certain things that we don't want people seeing us do, like summoning whatever these things are. Diana Pasulka, when I spoke to her recently, was hesitant to call them craft. She was like, they're summoning something, but do we know they are craft? So yeah, they've came out and they've gave us this really tangible thing. They've went, here's the thing, and we went, okay, show us it working. And they've not said they can't, but we're yet to see the thing working. And that's they can do that. They are giving themselves a length of rope here to hang themselves or to show us the goods.
All I will say is I think people should reserve judgment on Skywatcher. Watch this space. I think people should just reserve judgment and watch this space.
Do you know what I'm glad about? They've got backing. They've got private funding through connections with Alex Klokas, SALT Conference. I'm glad they came out not selling tickets to an event to say we're trying to fundraise or, brilliant. Excellent. You guys have got some serious money behind you. That's what you need for this topic. It can put people off, but you guys have got it already. I hope they can do something. And it looks like they're trying to give us dates. They're hoping, they said 6 to 8 weeks from mid-February. So something around April time, they might be coming out with their part 2. More stuff seems to be what they're going for. So let me ask you a question philosophically, though, Lester. Off the back of this, right, I spoke to Dean Alioto and we had a really good chat around his new feature documentary, The Alien Perspective, but trying to dive into some stuff outside of that because people don't want to just hear me speak to a director of another documentary. Is there an argument that as a species, we aren't in a good place right now to be accepted into whatever galactic federation is out there or any other species coming by and keeping tabs on us? We aren't in a good place right now.
Yep.
Is there an argument that we should be wary of another species who is willing to interact with us and perhaps reveal themselves and offer assistance, help, technology, if they're so much more advanced and they can see how we are and some of the unspeakably horrific things we do as a species still, to really question why something would want to interact with us on a bigger scale than they already are?
I think Stephen Hawking has kind of made this point about aliens generally, which is in our understanding of history, like human history, right? Anytime you had a more advanced civilization meet a less advanced civilization, it didn't really work out well for the less advanced civilization. And that's a truism that has existed for the entirety of the existence of our species. So I think your point is history proves your point to be true. Will that be the case moving forward is yet to be seen. But, I think this is the whole art. Like, we're not, as a global society, we're not in a collectively healthy position for any number of reasons. And so if there is this higher order of a higher order of being, like if in the hierarchy of beings, if there's something in between us and the creator's energy, right, or God, or whatever you want to label it as, depending on what books your parents read, I don't know that we are in a position for anyone in the in-between to want to, we don't integrate, bears and wolves and all these other animals into as domesticated animals in our houses. Dogs and cats, they were ready, right? Or we made them ready. And so it's complicated. I think this is, again, not as much where I spend a lot of my thought process and doing a lot of thinking. So I'm a little naive in this area. There are plenty of people who are more well-versed to speak to it. But this becomes it's the Sentinel Island argument, right? Right. Sentinel Island being the small island in the Indian Ocean that the Indian government basically says no one's allowed there. It's an old tribal, civilization that lives there, and they're not modernized, whatever, right? And we could be in that kind of situation, that scale, where we're just, we're a little, where everyone's like, they're not ready yet. Let them stop playing with their little, nukes and blah blah blah. So I think it's reasonable, but I who knows?
Lester, let's get to some listener questions to start rounding off, if you don't mind. Thanks to everyone who sent stuff in. People by now are quite good to caveat their questions to say, you might answer this in the body of the interview anyway. Yes, folks, some of that stuff has been asked, but please do send it in, because sometimes I'll forget to add that kind of thing and I go, oh, I'll build it in, which is what I do. Dave Smethurst sent over 147 questions.
Shout out Dave.
Dave's one of the OGs listening to the podcast as well, and it fills my heart with warmth when I see that he still gets in touch. So cheers, Dave. I'm going to pick a couple of yours to get to. You said there seems to be two disclosure approaches out there. One, the traditional congressional route of exposing historical programs through testimony and document release. And two, the DIY summon the UAP yourself and initiate contact as per Jake Barber. Which does Lester think will work best, and are they compatible approaches?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to so great question. This is the disclosure discovery paradigm thing that I talked about earlier. I think it's a yes and, not an either or. Like, I think you need both, because at the end of the day, great, you summon them, and then we now know it exists. Okay, the government is inherently going to be involved in any process that involves this stuff after the fact, right? Whether it's like regulating the process, are they going to create a registry for psionic assets, right? Like, are you going to have to like register if you have these capabilities? Like, people probably don't want that. Like, are we going to start investing money into rebuilding our military industrial complex totally based on this stuff? Who owns it? What's the IP rights? Is someone going to go to jail? Like, these are all questions that the government would be involved in, even if the DIY thing happened. So I just view it as you need to make sure the government is not blindsided and is going to be able to then actually like deal with the issues that are going to be on their plate after this stuff happens. And I think this is why you've heard Jake say, we're trying to work with the government around this, because at the end of the day, like, he understands what I understand, which is you can't have the process come out and like information be revealed without then all of the like follow-on things that need to be addressed as it pertains to the subject, given the enormity of the issue.
Yeah, it's less of a worrying that Jake Barber and co are in leagues with the shadowy cabals, but more they're trying to give opportunities that, you know, this is potentially going to come out. And I don't know, does this perhaps allude to when you mentioned before, Lester, about some of the comments being made by people like Jake Barber aren't for public consumption, but they're being put out publicly to be aimed at others. It's almost an olive branch of, look, this is going to happen. We are trying to bring you along. Otherwise, it's going to get ugly for you and me. Let's try and do something together on this. Is that right?
I believe, yes, that's my conjecture of what I believe is like they. And again, if you look at, like, you can see the pieces coming together, right? Read Lou Elizondo's policy brief on advanced strategic capabilities that's on the UAPDF website, right? And then correlate that with what you hear Jake Barber saying of trying to deconflict with government programs. There seems to be some kind of close overlap, right, between quote unquote advanced strategic capabilities, which is like bureaucratic speak for the equivalent of like ARVs or like derivative technologies, or understanding some aspects and using it for our own stuff, blue programs, and true UAP, right? And probably the concern is that like these guys don't know about all the Blue Force programs. So the last thing they want to do is be outing our own stuff. And so partly like the job that they seem to be going through is trying to like deconflict and make sure that whatever they do go public with is not our stuff. That seems to me to be what some of the public messaging that they've been doing. Like, the audience is partly us, but partly, hey, we've tried to call you guys, we've tried to come in and meet, we went to the Intel committee, da 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 da. No one has said boo, so we're about to do this thing. Are you guys sure that no one wants to raise their hand and say, hey, that's us? Again, that's my conjecture, but if you just listen to what they're saying, that's kind of like the implication.
Yeah, very, very interesting, very true. Dave also asks, does the revelation that it's likely the legacy programs and main UAP information is held under the Presidential Emergency Action Directive, PEADS, framework change Lester's approach to using Congress to get the information? Lester, can you do me a favor? If you understand that question, can you explain it to me like I'm stupid?
Yeah, so PEADS are basically a set of executive they're these classified executive documents for like continuity of government operations and things like that. So, you know, if a nuke hits DC or like, you know, these crazy circumstances, there's like these procedures for like what the executive branch is going to do in order to make sure they can continue to function and, you know, provide for the common defense and all this other stuff. PEDs are not accessible by members of Congress. They're classified within the executive branch. And so like even members of Congress don't know what's in them. It's a great place to hide stuff if you're the executive branch in these presidential executive action directives. But so there one of the arguments has been that the UFO stuff in part is protected under these PEDs. So it's like there's a combination of things. There is the Atomic Energy Act, which is law, that creates a carve out that basically allows anything that has foreign nuclear information to be born classified, right? So there's like that, and since it's law, like that's like it's hard to get around. There's a National Security Act of 1947, I guess it is, that also creates the secrecy infrastructure that is also used for this issue, and then there's PEDs. So like these three things, and this goes back to Dylan Guthrie's long legal analysis in the Harvard National Security Review, which is a great read if you really want to get into the weeds on some of this stuff. They are all bureaucratic infrastructures that create a cone of silence where you could shove the UFO stuff. So at a high level, like, yes, theoretically, it is a tool that could be utilized to create secrecy around this. And the argument is that the National Security Council within the White House is the owner of the legacy program, right? And they sort of work with the CIA as a partner in the facilitation of the secrecy infrastructure around this. So that's like the one of the arguments, one of the stories around like where is the center of power, for lack of a better term, around the legacy program infrastructure. I will also sort of mention though, at the same time that there is sort of this constellation of these programs where people die and age out, where there's these bigot lists and there's not read-ins and they're need to know. So there's also like a constellation of stuff that might be under these structures, but are so the people that ran them are no longer there, and they've kind of been just sort of they're there, but they don't really they're not a part of the normal chain of command, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is part of if you read the book that Jake Barber and co put out that he talked about, they went through the Dopser process to try to basically figure out what they would say, what they would allow and not allow. If you read it, what they're basically kind of alleging is like there is the black team, quote unquote, is basically is like a non-governmental entity, and they have basically been inserting themselves into the ecosystem of government contracting and classified programs to redirect stuff to them operating outside of the government infrastructure. So while it may be true, like there's potentially two things happening here, where you have the legacy program of the government who are trying to still wrestle control from this quote unquote black team, which is a total extra governmental entity that has nothing to do with PEDs or any of this other stuff. This gets like really into the weeds, but
Yeah.
that's the best I can try to explain that ecosystem, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And thanks. And when I say explain it to me like I'm stupid, I needed that because, folks, I don't always understand everything that's put forward to me on here. And listeners' questions can be far more eloquent than I can even put forward. So I appreciate it, Lester. Got a question for you that I know you are a practical guy. And you mentioned this before when I asked you the kind of more philosophical alien question, but I'm going to put another one to you. Joni for Ash says, I'm interested to know what people know about the rumored Project Bluebeam. I've heard it referred to occasionally, but not heard anyone talk about it. Lester, for folks on audio, has his head in his hands. So if anyone's unsure, the idea simply that a government, let's just say the one that's in power now in the US or others, would fake an alien invasion using some kind of holographic or drone type technology. It could be an invasion, could be like a mass sighting, could be like an event, something. They would fake it to bring forward a totalitarian state or government. Can you see that kind of thing happening? And it's a very strange world we live in, Lester. Let's be fair.
Look, anything is possible. My whole thing with Project Bluebeam, which I get so many comments on my TikTok anytime I post anything, it's Project Blue Balls, Project Bluebeam, whatever. My only argument is there is no need to fake an alien invasion to facilitate the creation of a totalitarian state in the current environment. You don't need like it's extra work that's unnecessary. So I just again, it's like what is the incentive to do so? You don't need to. So and that's just kind of where it starts and ends for me, right? Like some people argue it's already happening right now without even having to do anything other than, you know, make declarations.
Yeah.
So I don't buy it, right? I just don't think it's necessary.
Look at the drone stuff that happened on the east coast of the US. Is that a version of it? I mean, I don't think so, folks, but there were strange things in the sky for whatever reason. Was it something that a group done to get at Trump and the incoming administration in advance? A little bit of a warning shot across the bow.
Yep.
Who knows? That could be like a blue beam type event.
Sure.
I wouldn't put it past.
And I think that there's a distinction here, which is like someone may have the capability to do this holographic thing. What reason would they use it? For me, it would make more sense they would use it for power dynamic mafia war control stuff. I don't think they need it in order to facilitate the creation of a totalitarian state.
Yeah, fair enough. Ricky says, "Hi Andy, can you ask Lester what is his opinion on what the magnitude of the government finally acknowledging everything UAP related, if that happens, and what he thinks society would do with that information?" So basically, we get confirmation.
Yeah, I mean, it obviously would change the dynamics of a lot of things. At the same time, I think the challenge that we have is that, and we kind of brushed upon this earlier, we no longer have a shared reality, like a shared we no longer have a shared common space of like what is true and what is not true. So I think the challenge becomes because we've now been because of social media and algorithms and all this stuff, I talk about this ad nauseum, we're all in our little, information bubbles. So the hope would be that it's something so monumental that it breaks through all of those to create some form of shared context. But like it's going to be difficult. I've made the argument the best time for this stuff to have come out was probably in between when the Berlin Wall fell and 9/11, because we still had some semblance of shared context, right? It was sort of pre-internet. It was harder to fake stuff with AI and blah blah blah. So
Yeah.
people can just dismiss everything as like, oh, it's fake news. Like now we have this whole knee-jerk reaction when people don't want to actually like digest information of saying, oh, it's fake news or it's a conspiracy or I don't believe it, right?
Yeah.
So I think it would fundamentally change everything. Even if it's just because like, oh, like it creates a new free energy source. Like that changes all geopolitical dynamics and uh 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 urban planning and how like you structure cities. Like if you no longer need central power generation because everyone can just have an egg that's a nuclear reactor at their house that lasts forever. I mean, the implications are oil and gas, the petrodollar. I mean, it's monumental. It's a total restructuring of society. The problem is there's a difference between knowing the information and then taking the stuff and incorporating it into like the infrastructure of the world, which would take a long time, right? It would take decades, if not longer. So the implications would be hard, almost immeasurably immense.
Yeah, I think that's why we're going to see a follow-up to After Disclosure, the book you mentioned earlier from Richard Dolan and Bryce Zabel. I think we are getting a revised edition, which is probably long overdue at this point. And this question from Kenzo, I think, is a nice way to wrap up before we kind of finish off, Lester. For those of us who lost hope in the political process when the UAP Disclosure Act got squashed, and given the willful ignorance of the media, what hope do we have of really moving the ball forward in a powerful and meaningful way this year that genuinely breaks through to the ordinary working person who is oblivious to the topic?
It's a great question. It's the fundamental question everyone always asks, right? And so I'll say a couple of things. One, we all have to remember that what we're asking for is a total rewrite of the entire global social contract. That's what disclosure is, right? It's a complete rewrite. If you look at any historical rewrite of the social contract, civil rights movement, women's suffrage movement, like all these things, they take blood, sweat, and tears, people in the streets. Like it's hard work, right? It's not just tweeting about it, and it's going to be hard. So I need people like constantly remember, like we're trying to do something that hasn't happened for decades for a reason. And so we have to recognize we're gonna have to be uncomfortable and do things different and new in order to like effectuate change. So that's like a number one starting point. Number two, I understand in the US, like because Trump is so polarizing, and I'm not gonna adjudicate, like, I get it, guys. So people are just like checked out. They don't want to support him being the disclosure president, period, regardless of whether he like wants to or not. So like I get that. That's fine. That's everyone's prerogative to have their own political leanings and feelings. Um, that's the executive branch. They have the keys. So the fastest way to facilitate disclosure is by the president mandating that it comes out. The second angle is through Congress, right? And unfortunately, there's so many things taking up the oxygen in the room that we have to fight tooth and nail to maintain the oxygen around this issue, which is the stuff that we've been doing, for the last 3 years. So we have to continue to create the political incentive for people to continue to spend the political capital to keep this issue alive. So we have to beat the drum, right? The last note I'll make is, as with everything, the sky's not classified, as both Avi Loeb and Jacob said. Like your consciousness is not, whatever. We're free to do whatever we want to. There are people who are trying to create the tools for us to get the answers ourselves, and we need to elevate those people and support them, right? Mitch Randall is trying to create his at-home passive radar system where we create a decentralized network of them that all go into the same place and we get our own data, right? So for any folks who are like, I don't trust the government, I don't believe the government, like they're never going to tell us the truth, totally fair. I get you. My view is that the government is going to be involved in this process one way or another, regardless of whether you like it or not. So I would like them to be as prepared as possible for when that moment happens. That's a big driver of the work. But if you believe that they have no role in getting the information out at first, you need to support the research community. And there's a difference between historical research, right? And like current study programs that are trying to actually get the data and get the material, right? And that's like, if you don't believe in government disclosure discovery paradigm, right? Focus your energy on supporting those research efforts. I mean, as an example, we just put up on UAP Caucus a new feature for our research page. So we try to put out all these research papers for UAP studies because people act like that's not happening. Like there was a massive paper on the new science of unidentified aerospace and undersea phenomenon that came out with Gary Nolan, Ryan Graves, the Tedesco brothers, like every big name that you can think about in the science side of this were on that paper. I can guarantee you 99% of the people listening to this podcast have not read that paper.
Yeah.
Right? It came out 3 weeks ago. Okay. So that's like something that's tangibly happening, that's talking about this subject and moving it forward. We put up audio summaries to help people engage with it because none of us have time. I get it. It's 100 pages, whatever. So now listen to 10 to 25 minutes, go and actually listen to all of the research and like where that actually is and find ways to support the likes of these upstart projects that are trying to get off the ground. If you're a builder, right, we need to build diagnostic tools for being able to assess radar data sets. If Skywatcher comes out tomorrow and puts out multiple data sets saying, look at all we have, this is the data that proves it. We don't actually have the tools to adjudicate that as a ecosystem, right? So we need to build all this stuff and we don't need to wait for the government to do so. So I know that's not accessible necessarily for everybody, right? Not everyone's a technical operator or a radar specialist or any of this stuff. So if you're in a position where you don't have those skill sets to build and you don't believe in government disclosure, the number one thing you can do is talk to your friends and talk to your family and onboard them, because people don't trust the news. They don't trust, the government. They don't trust, but they do trust Khloe Kardashian. They do trust you, right? There are certain people that people do trust. And so like it's incumbent on us to spend as much time as we can helping to bring the people around us where we can break through the prior biases because you have a personal relationship with them to start to get interested in this. So that's the number one thing that anyone can do that doesn't require any skill set beyond being willing to put yourself out there around people you trust and to get them interested in the subject. Because once you start unlocking some of these people, some of them may have skill sets to be able to add to the research community. Some of them may know people that work in the government that they can get in their ear to push them to say, you should do something about this. So that is the number one thing we can do. This is going to be hard work, y'all. Like, that's what we signed up for. No one's going to spoon feed us the answer. And so if we're still waiting to be spoon fed, you're in the wrong business.
Hard work that is made a little bit easier by people like yourself, Lester, because UAPcaucus.com, you've just mentioned that new feature. I wanted to round off on this. For folks who have listened to Lester now for nearly 2 hours, spending his time with me and with you, go and check out our original interview where I speak to Lester more about his background and the early grassroots work. But tell us a little bit about UAP Caucus and, of course, that new feature, because I started listening to that paper you mentioned and was surprised to hear two voices. And I was like, oh, it's a podcast. Then I realized, it's not just an AI. It's not like, that AI voice of, this is a paper by this person who did it. No, it's eerily organic. So if you want to talk about that as well, let's start to finish off.
Yeah, no. So, my background's in software and technology. So I always think about, like, how can I apply that skill set to this issue? And, like, one of the things is just research papers are very dense, and it's very hard for people to wrap their head around and understand what's happening, but they're information rich. So there's this feature from a Google product called Notebook LM that allows you to take PDFs and create a 2-person conversational podcast on the substance of that content. So we put this out as an experimental feature because AI tools are now getting to the point where they're actually quite good and they can be used, quote unquote, in production. And the idea was, we're trying to just help more people. If you look at UAP Caucus as an ecosystem, it has a bunch of resources to help people get into the subject. We have guides, we have the research section, we have a news tab, we have the origin classification system. We put out a standards of evidence framework because everyone's like, oh, where's the evidence? But we don't actually have a standards of evidence. Like, what is a threshold for calling something anomalous as it relates to different types of sensor data? No one's really had that conversation. So we're trying to, like, again, create these resources to help people continue to ingratiate themselves in the subject. The AI summary for the research papers felt like an obvious, easy thing to do, because instead of spending 2 hours listening to me talk with you, which people, thankfully, if you're here, you did, you should go spend that time listening to these papers, right? Like, that's like real substantive information about, like, the beef, the where's the beef question, right? And so I'm continuing to try to push with UAP Caucus, right? We fundamentally believe in that disclosure discovery paradigm. So it is both the government work, like working with staffers, trying to push policy, trying to get things to happen there, as well as elevating what's happening in the research community. One of the things we're going to be working on an interesting, we're going to be trying to spin up more tools for this space. And I think over the coming months, people have seen me kind of put a few of these things out on my Twitter, just like example mock-ups and stuff. But I think we're really going to try to ramp up on a few interesting new tools that will be good not only for people who are doing FOIA, it'll be good for the new stuff coming out of the National Archives because of the requirements of the parts of the UAPDA that did pass. So we're going to get new stuff there, outreach tools, and open data sets. Like, we're putting together something I think that's going to be really, really interesting. So I'll have more on that soon. And when it's ready for prime time, it'll be actually something that I can come on and walk through on here. And because I think people will find it very, just again, useful for us to take control of the process, right? And not, again, wait to be spoon fed.
Awesome. And Lester, I truly mean it when I say you are one of those folks that, not just up and coming, because you are here, you are doing the work. If me doing this podcast helps people get on board or stay on board with the topic, you are doing a whole range of incredible activities that are getting folks on board. You're helping people who are at really, really important levels of the conversation, academically, scientifically, politically, do really important work in the background and the foreground. I know that much as well. So thank you for what you've been doing. And if folks aren't following you or checking out the website, the links will be in the description. But Lester is one of those names that I really think people should be looking at and giving a thanks in any way they can for the work you're doing, mate. So well done.
I appreciate it. It's going to take a village, and we all have a role to play. I appreciate everything that you do of continuing to platform voices and continuing the conversation, despite, I know, the trials and tribulations that people feel like we're going through, which I don't agree with. I think we're in an incredible place. And just think back, guys, to 2017 and where we were. And, we're in a very different place today. I think we should continue to be proud and happy about the work that we've done, and also be understanding of the work that we still have to do.
That is all for this episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. Don't forget to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. Apple and Spotify do make a huge difference to the algorithm. If you're checking the show out on YouTube, please don't forget to like and leave a comment on here as well. Any sharing you do is very much appreciated on any social media platform. And finally, you can listen to shows ad-free and sponsor-free in their glorious full versions by subscribing for less than the price of a coffee on Apple, Spotify. Just search That UFO Podcast Premium. YouTube, you can sign up and be a member, or you can do that through patreon.com. Thank you very much for listening, folks.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his